Hello friends, we are going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about the relationship between three different ideas: gender, violence and human rights. I'll begin by looking at the idea of human rights itself. The idea of human rights might be attributed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights made in the year 1948 in the General Assembly of the United Nations in the aftermath of the war. As we know, the Second World War had gendered consequences. It impacted men and women differently. However, the one thing that brought together people across the world was a resolve to resist similar attacks on humanity. People came together for the pursuit of rights, equality, and fair access to justice systems. This is the spirit of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is premised on the principle, is based on the idea that all human beings across the world, irrespective of their race, gender, caste, age, ethnic or linguistic identity, religious identity, must have and should have equal access to all the wonderful principles that I mentioned earlier. This, of course, are glorious ideals. How much has it been translated into reality? Formally, most member states of the United Nations have taken active steps to execute these principles. But in substantive measures, there is still a long way to go. One of the areas where I think a long distance yet needs to be traveled and covered is the area of gender rights, gender equality. 1995 is a crucial year for us in this discussion because this is the year that the Beijing Declaration actually announced openly and loudly that women's rights are equal to human rights. It went a step further by facilitating the passing of the CEDAW, the Convention Against the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Clearly, there was a realization that while human rights existed as a declaration, as a charter of principles, however, in reality, women and men were not able to enjoy these rights or experience these rights in equal measures. There are many reasons for this, but in today's discussion, we are going to focus on one of the reasons that perhaps makes this experience uneven. And that reason that we are going to examine today is gender-based violence. In order to understand that and in order to make a relationship between gender-based violence and the limitation of the experience of human rights, we'd have to spend a little bit of time first trying to define what gender is and then trying to define what violence is. And then we'll bring all of these three together. When we think about human rights, and with all the grand preface that I presented to you about human rights, we discover and we begin to understand that while it existed on paper and formally the declaration was made, but in substantive terms, there have been many groups that have actually been kept out of the pale of the experience of human rights. So it took a long while. It has taken persistent struggles, women's groups, for instance, human rights activists, tribal activists, many other scholars, academics, journalists, lawyers have been in the forefront of the fight to make human rights a universal experience, a truly universal experience. This is not to suggest that we have won the battle. It still remains to be won. There is a long way before we can actually sit back and say that human rights have truly become universal. As I mentioned earlier, one of the dimensions of today's discussion is gender. So when we speak about gender, what we discover is that human rights too has been unequally available to different genders in our world. What does gender mean? We will of course talk about this later. But one of the most crucial declarations in this context or proclamations in this context was made at the Beijing conference, The Beijing conference happened in 1995, and it was here that the Declaration of Human Rights for Women. So the slogan now became, women's rights are human rights. As you can see on that picture on your slide, women's rights are human rights. This meant that there was an acceptance of the fact that for women, a special effort would have to be made in order to acknowledge that they too have human rights. Does this mean that the term human being did not include women? No, that is not what it means. What it means is that in substantive terms, women were not able to enjoy the kind of human rights that the General Assembly way back in 1945 had guaranteed to all human beings. However, an extra push, an extra thrust has been necessitated, and we see this in the form of the Millennium Development Goals and in the form of the SDGs, which I'll talk about in a little while. The 1995 Beijing Platform for Action, as you can see on your screens, gave this phenomenal and really inspiring slogan which said, women's rights equals human rights. But more importantly, the Beijing Platform for Action actually talked about the CEDAW. The CEDAW means the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Signatories to this, that means the members of the United Nations, were obliged to make human rights, the experience of human rights, more substantive for women. So as you can see, at the formal level, there is equality, there is freedom, there is non-discrimination as far as laws are concerned. But substantively, this experience leaves much to be desired. And in a process of review of this declaration, the Millennium Development Goal number 3 talks about promoting gender equality to empower women, and the Sustainable Development Goal, you would see on your screen soon, number 5 actually. If you can go back, you would see this slide. Number 5 talks about gender equality. And that's a very, very important guideline for the community of nations. Now both the MDG, the SDG, the Beijing Platform for Action and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of this basically are telling us that the ideals of human rights exist, but the reality is somewhat different. Now, what is it that prevents women in this case, because I'm going to focus on women, what is it that prevents women from experiencing these universal human rights? One of the reasons for that is gender-based violence. Move to the next concept within today's interaction, that's the concept of gender. We'll spend very few minutes trying to understand. One of the things that I think I'd like to draw your attention to is the fact that gender actually refers to a range of socially constructed identities, and it attributes roles for women and men, and it creates hierarchical relationships based on those roles for men and women. These hierarchies, more often than not across the world, seem to advantage men and disadvantage women. What do we mean by that? If you take a look at this picture, you can, this is of course a cartoon, but I'm sure you can understand what this is suggesting. Supposing men and women both have to climb up stairs, and men have a lovely shiny escalator to go up, and women have steep stairs, and they have to carry their shopping, and they have to carry their baby on their hips. Obviously, some women are going to decide not to want to climb up the stairs. Some are going to be injured while trying to climb up the stairs. Some might fall down. Some might reach the top but might be really drained out by the time they do that. Whereas for the men, it seems to be much easier. So this is what I meant when I said that there is the possibility of gender actually creating hierarchies which advantage women and advantage men and disadvantage women. And the purpose of human rights really is to create a world which does not have these disadvantages. If that's what gender is, and there are these inequalities, then what is the connection between violence and gender and human rights? So that's the next step in our discussion. Now we take a look at the connection between gender, violence and human rights. Now if you look at the slide in front of you, you would see that gender-based violence is actually a result of an unequal society. That means when you have one group having more power over another group, it could result in, and very often it does result in, violence. The world that we live in currently, the fact is that it is characterized by men having more power than women by and large. And hence, the nature of violence in the world that we live in today is such where women are more likely to be subjected to violence and men are more likely to be perpetrators of violence. So gender-based violence is perpetrated against someone because of the gender that that person belongs to. That's why we call it gender-based violence. And what is the impact? There is a long-term impact. Of course, there is a short-term impact, which is injury, but a long-term impact is that people suffer psychologically, people suffer economically, socially, and they become unsure of themselves. Some of them actually become so unsure that they are no longer fit for employment or normal interaction in society. So the impact of violence on the victim, so-called victim, is of course very severe. But I want to draw attention to the fact that every instance of violence has not only a victim, but it also has a perpetrator. So for every woman who is a victim, there is a man who is a perpetrator. And using violence has psychological impact on the man, just as experiencing violence has psychological impact on women. So the discourse of human rights is actually trying to help us think of a world where men would not have to use violence and women would not have to experience violence. That really, in substantive terms, is what we are trying to move towards. You would see, and these statistics could be slightly old, but by and large you would see that women are 11 times more likely to report violence. There is a larger proportion of women who are victims of violence, but within this proportion, within these numbers, I'd like us to remember that number of disabled women or women with disabilities are actually even larger, and because they are in a position where they are absolutely vulnerable to violent attacks. You would see that from the 1990s actually, the world over and especially in India, violence against women has gathered, the issue of violence against women specifically and the issue of gender-based violence has gathered momentum. This picture that you see on your presentation right now is actually drawing attention to the fact that in many cultures like ours, where we are taught to respect women and treat them like goddesses on the one hand, despite that, on the other hand, the number of women who are reporting violent crimes against them has been consistently increasing, and this causes us great alarm, and therefore we need to understand why this is the case. However, I think I'm very happy to share with all of us that women and men increasingly are resisting this culture of violence. So just as there is violence, there is also resistance to this violence. What is really important for men and women is to break the silence around the issue of violence and talk about the impunity with which the perpetrator actually acts violently and give courage to the victim of violence. So these are some of the things that of course we need to do, but let's try and spend some time on understanding violence itself. So broadly, the types of violence are physical, sexual, economic and emotional. This is not an exhaustive list. We can add many more. Now, violence is a continuum. It starts actually before the act of violence is committed and the impact of violence continues after the violent act has been committed. So when we talk about violence, we need to remember the person who is planning that violence and what kind of a psychological impact it has on that person, then the actual experience of violence, and then the aftermath of that violence. If we look at physical violence, it's very clear that you can see on the slide, it refers to a range of physical beating, brutality, using household objects to hit or stab, and so on and so forth. And here there is it's a funny picture for you to remember that real men perhaps can beat eggs and not women. Another kind of violence that women in our part of the world experience is the neglect of their bodily needs, that in other words of their health. So a lot of times we hear of women dying during childbirth, women not being allowed to go to a doctor, women not being allowed to avail of health care. These are all incidents of violence actually. Look at sexual violence. Again, there is a whole range of experiences that women have reported under this category. I am focusing on women in this presentation for the simple reason that it is not possible in one presentation to talk about the entire spectrum of gendered violence. This is not to say that men do not experience violence. It is not to say that within this discussion, the experience of violence by disabled people, by trans people, religious minorities, all of these are important. But our focus today is on gender-based violence broadly, and within that, the experience of violence by women. So as you can see, sexual violence on your slide tells you the kinds of violence that women are subjected to. Within India, we have had many successful campaigns that are talking about the need to prevent violence both on the streets, at the workplace, within the household. So domestic violence is another very big concern when we talk about gender-based violence. Emotional violence. Emotional violence it includes stalking, it includes threats, it includes harassment. On your slide, you can see a shot from a very popular Bollywood film. Many Bollywood films unfortunately glorify and romanticize the hero stalking the woman. This is actually violence. It's actually emotional violence, and it needs to be called out as such. And it's not something that women enjoy. Use of children to actually not only violence directed at children, but to traumatize the mother, to traumatize the woman. One way usually, or sometimes, maybe not usually actually, sometimes the children are attacked, the children are subjected to violence. This too is a cause for great concern. Use of language. So language-based violence. Language which is insulting, which is aggressive, which is intimidatory, which is uses foul words, and usually refers to either women's body parts or women's relatives. This is fairly common in South Asia. A woman is not allowed to speak sometimes. She's shut down as being too loud and shrill, as you can see in that cartoon strip on your screen. If you pay attention, you would see that when a woman speaks, she is shrill, but when a man speaks, it's insightful. This is a kind of violence using language and communication that women are often subjected to. And then, of course, a very important dimension of violence is economic violence. This actually includes various dimensions, but I'll just talk about some, and it is listed on your screen. Prohibiting women from working. If they work, not allowing them to have control over their financial resources, not allowing them to do certain kinds of jobs and professions, withholding important financial information from women, refusing to pay bills required for their maintenance or for the maintenance of their children, destroying jointly owned property. These are some common ways in which women are subjected to economic violence. If you look at this cartoon, it's really actually talking about the way the world of employment is actually stacked against women, and that is a form of violence. Please look at the crack in the wall. The crack in the wall fits a man. It doesn't fit a woman who has a child. This is a kind of, this is an example of what you might want to call structural violence. So violence always need not mean somebody beating somebody else. Here we have a woman who was a victim of acid attacks. In our part of the world, this is a cause for great concern. One of the biggest concerns for us, or one of the insights of our investigation of the idea of gender-based violence has been to explore where exactly does this violence occur. What are the sites of this violence? And we would see that violence occurs in diverse kinds of places. Violence occurs in the family. The family, which is supposed to be the site of love, affection, nurturance, cooperation, unfortunately can also become the site of great oppression and a great deal of violence. It's not uncommon for cases of domestic abuse, for dowry deaths, for marital rape. We know all of these instances happen in our society as well, but for the sake of the family, women are expected to keep quiet about it. This culture of silence is what I was alluding to earlier. Another common site of violence is, of course, the community and the society. The community, by not taking cognizance of the violence that women experience, the community, by not recognizing that violence is harmful for women and it denies them their human rights, becomes a partner in the perpetration of violence. Workplace is another context where violence occurs routinely. And of course we have a law now which is the Prevention of Sexual Harassment at the Workplace. However, that law is once again a formal entity. Substantively, women still find it difficult to get their voice heard, to be equal partners at work, to enjoy their contribution to the growing economy of our country. For instance, women need to be free from the fear of violence at work. The street. In some parts of the world, this is called eve teasing, but if you look at it very carefully, it's actually street harassment and not just eve teasing, because women experience fear of this violence. Stepping out on the streets in some parts of the world is an extremely violent experience for women. So to go back to the sites of violence, family, the community, the workplace, the street, and finally the state itself. The state, which is supposed to protect and guarantee women's human rights, sometimes turns against women and is not able to protect women's human rights. Not only is it not able to protect, sometimes the state is responsible for violating the human rights and especially treating women with great deal of violence. In very specific instances, I would mention conflict areas, not only within India but in all parts of the world. Conflict zones become areas where states get away with all kinds of unbelievable violence against women. I've already talked about the human rights violation due to violence of trans women and women with disability. As you can see on the slide, trans women and disabled women experience great degrees of violence directed against them. There are some myths about gender-based violence that I'd like to take up in the last few minutes of our discussion. It's commonly assumed that women accept violence. Well, probably they do to a certain extent because they do not have an alternative, but it's not really true that they accept it all the time or they accept it everywhere. Women have and continue to resist violence, and we'll talk about that in just a little while. You can see that there are other ways in which violence is justified. It is seen as a personality aberration, it is seen as a consequence of substance abuse. At a later date, perhaps we can discuss all of these myths individually and separately, and this might be an interesting point for us to discuss further. What is the impact of violence? I've already spoken about this in an earlier slide. The impact of violence is that it affects women's health, it affects women's ability to pursue opportunities for employment, for education, for social interaction, to pursue leisure. In other words, women's human rights are totally violated and adversely affected by the experience of violence. However, the good news is that we can stop this violence, and we can stop this violence through united efforts. As you can see in the next slide, the pictures of some of the very big demonstrations, rallies, women's movement, women's gatherings that have tried to question the experience of violence. On the top left corner of the slide, you can see a demonstration that happened in the wake of the infamous December 16th incident in Delhi. On the right are mothers, Manipuri mothers, protesting the violence that they experienced in their interaction with the Indian Army. In the 1970s, when dowry deaths were actually quite common in the city of Delhi, women's organizations came together and protested this violence, and because of that we now have legislations against many of these instances of violence. So I would like to end by saying that while women's rights continue to be violated by the incidents of violence, by the experience of violence, however, there is hope, and that hope lies in the fact that women and men are increasingly recognizing not only the futility of violence, but they're also recognizing the impact that this violence has both on the victim and the perpetrator. With this realization, it's possible for men and women to actually come together and challenge the experience of violence both at the formal level and at the substantive level, through legislations and through structural changes, through cultural changes. All of these have to happen together and simultaneously, and that is the way to go forward and actually translate the wonderful set of human rights into a reality for men and women and other genders all over the world. Thank you.